Welcome to the 10-Minute Treasure. My name is Jeff Pospisil. And do you know the difference between a cash housing allowance and a housing exclusion? And can you have a cash housing allowance and a housing exclusion, or are they something you can't have both at the same time? So that's what I'm going to be looking at. Hopefully you'll find this helpful as you're working out your pastor's compensation. I like how my good friend Roy Caudill describes the difference. He says an exclusion is what you claim, an allowance is what you get. So an exclusion is what you claim, an allowance is what you get. So the housing exclusion is something a pastor would claim. So they would designate part of their salary. They're not getting extra money. They're just claiming that exclusion. The cash housing allowance is something you get. That's extra money in your pocket. So that's what we mean by this. Let me go ahead and walk through just a couple of scenarios. So whether you live in a parsonage or you receive a cash housing allowance in lieu of a parsonage. So that's the big thing too. By the way, a cash housing allowance is in lieu of a parsonage. So back in the old days, it was quite common that a pastor would have their parsonage right next to the church. And so that's what it is in this case. I'm glad it's no longer as common anymore. I think that's kind of stressful. So let's just imagine, for example, that the pastor of this church, they get paid $45,000. And they go through and they estimate, what their actual expenses might be. And they estimate on the very high end, it might be $5,000. So they're still going to get the whole $45,000, but this $40,000 is what's reported to the IRS as taxable income. That other $5,000 is not. So it doesn't change the amount they're paid, but it does change what is reported to the IRS as taxable income. Now let's say the church gets rid of the parsonage, and instead, in lieu of the parsonage, they decide to give you a cash housing allowance. And this happens to be the amount. $15,000 annually is what they pay you for the cash housing allowance. By the way, they could pay it to you with your paycheck. They can cut you an extra check, usually at least once a month, but it'll be an extra amount that goes towards you. So this amount, by the way, this $15,000 is already excluded as housing. So this is already not reported to the IRS as compensation. But then let's say again, you get that $45,000 salary, and maybe you think that your housing expenses are going to be a little bit higher than just $15,000. Maybe you think that they might be as high as $20,000. Then you can still go ahead and exclude another $5,000. So the total amount that you have available to spend on housing is this $5,000 plus the $15,000, so $20,000. And although you receive, what is that, $60,000 in cash from the church, only $40,000 is what's reported to the IRS for taxable income. And although I already kind of said this, the total amount paid to the pastor when the pastor was in the parsonage, it was $45,000. When the pastor had a cash housing allowance of $15,000, that total went up to $60,000. In both of these cases, though, $40,000 is what was reported to the IRS through the W-2. So $40,000 was what was put in box 1. And now let's look at self-employment income, because if you're not aware, for federal income tax purposes, the IRS considers a pastor to be an employee of the church. But for Social Security and Medicare purposes, the Social Security Administration considers the pastor to be self-employed. So there's two different standards here. And so what's reported in box 1 of your W-2, actually, you can't have anything in box 3 and box 5, which is Social Security and Medicare wages. So for a cash housing allowance, they look at the entire amount of cash received. So that $45,000 salary plus the $15,000 cash housing allowance, and the pastor's going to have to pay self-employment taxes is 15.3%. So they're going to have to pay 15.3% of that $60,000 for self-employment taxes. For the pastor living in the parsonage, they're going to have to pay self-employment taxes on that whole $45,000, plus they're going to have to pay 15.3% of the fair rental value of living in that parsonage for a year. And I have a different video that'll explain how to estimate what the fair rental value is, but it'll be somewhat significant. Normally it might be in this case, maybe it is $10,000 to $15,000, so you might end up in a similar place. So that's just something to think about as you're doing your tax planning. All right, hopefully this video has helped. Again, I just want to repeat that if you get a cash housing allowance in lieu of a parsonage, you can still claim additional housing exclusion on your salary to make sure that all your housing related expenses are covered. So, all right, till next time, God bless.